Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. This week, we're going to take a look at summative assessment and try to answer the question, how can we gauge the success of our trainings? Our learning objective this week is to develop strategies to assess learning as well as evaluate trainings. This week, we're talking summative assessment strategies. Remember, with summative assessment, we're trying to assess kind of a summary of the entire education. Whereas formative assessment is when we're assessing during the formation of learning, is kind of how I remember it. So formation is during, or formative assessment is during the learning process, and summative is at the end of the learning process. Some strategies we're going to talk about today is testing, portfolios, projects, and surveys. First, let's talk testing strategies. Right. Usually when we talk summative assessment, we're referring to either unit tests or final exams. But there's a lot of options kind of within that and how we can structure those tests. The first option is creating a pre-post test. What this does is allow you to measure growth instead of just measuring mastery. Okay, so pre-post is really popular in the training world because we see where learners are at before the training, where they're at after, and we can compare them to find that growth and to measure kind of what impact our training is really having. When we're talking about actual exams, of course, there's the multiple choice option is one. There's free response, right, or fill in the blank. You have the option of in-class essays. Okay, this is getting really popular as AI gets better and better, right? Sometimes you have to do that writing in person to ensure that our students are being honest there, and in-class essays is a great way to do that. Another option, oral exams, where students have to communicate directly kind of what they're thinking and answer those questions in person, in speech. There's also standardized assessments that are popular in different testing environments, things like the SAT, ACT, LSAT, right? You can imagine that all of those tests for those professional licenses have training programs associated with them, and what better way to test those programs than a standardized assessment at the end? We can also test using performance tests, right? Having people execute the actual action that we've been training or learning about, right? Something like a CPR training course ends with you performing CPR on a dummy, right? In that testing environment, the performance task assessment. And finally, simulations, right? As VR gets better and better, I think we'll see more and more simulation-based testing way down the line possibly, but definitely a lot of potential there to put our learners directly in the situation we're training them for and to have them try it out, right? So lots of different options there when we're talking tests. Next up, portfolios. Portfolios are a good alternative to test taking because they include multiple works from throughout the training. Okay, so instead of just pulling from one sample point or one day of assessment, we're including multiple points. Right, this both helps show both mastery and growth, similar to testing if we use pre-post test or a regular test. With the portfolio, we can also see that growth as we can see students improving throughout the semester or throughout the training. And based on those more checkpoints like we talked about, we're going to have less small sample size bias. What does that mean? Let's say someone had a really bad day on the final exam, right? That would significantly affect their grade and create kind of a bias. Maybe they weren't feeling well that day. Maybe they were sick, right? We don't want a really small sample size to kind of dictate their entire grade. Well, portfolios is a good alternative for that because we have lots of these checkpoints kind of throughout the semester that are then combined to create that summative assessment rather than just one individual day or a few days worth of sample size. Another option when we're talking about summative assessment is projects. This is where similarly we have kind of one big activity that represents our grade, similar to that test, but it can be a little more open than your traditional book test, right? So when we're talking projects, really the biggest advantage is how flexible they are, right? You can create a project that matches your learning standards directly or much better, hopefully, than a standard paper-based format. Another advantage of projects is that they can be either collaborative or individualized. Right? This gives you options for having students work with each other, especially if that's part of your learning standards, or just having students work together to save time, right? Maybe you don't have enough time in your class to watch 30 presentations, but we have enough for 5, so we make a collaborative project instead, right? There's kind of lots of pros and cons to either choosing collaborative or individualized, but at least when we make projects, we have kind of that option. As far as some different types of projects, okay, one standard one is the presentation. Okay, we have written reports or a common project. There's design work. Maybe you're designing something or submitting the blueprints for something, right? Drawing it up in a computer program, that sort of thing. And finally, creative work, where you're actually trying to create a piece of art, create a model of something, right? Lots of options when we're talking projects. It really depends kind of on your content area and what you want people creating and people doing, but definitely a lot of good options there, and just allowing students to get their hands onto an actual project or something that feels more realistic tends to really boost that motivation and have students kind of have more buy-in than your standard test. So projects, definitely another great option there. And the last summative assessment option I want to talk about is surveys. This is an interesting one because it doesn't actually involve the students executing the skill, right? Rather, we're assessing their perspectives and attitudes towards our course or specific skills, right? So we can ask students directly if they feel they've met the learning objectives. Hey, can you do this? Do you feel comfortable executing this skill? Right? This is called self-efficacy in the education world. Their belief that they can perform a capability or perform a skill. And I think it's pretty important, and it's quick and easy, right? That's the benefit of surveys, is it's a quick snapshot that doesn't involve a ton of grading or back-end work or preparation. It's just asking students, hey, did this help? Right? And I do think a lot can be learned from that. It also allows trainers to probe for possible areas of improvement, right? You can ask about areas where students got stuck. You can ask about areas where students think we need to do better, right? And you can take that and use that in the next cycle of recreating that training, right? We don't necessarily always have to see if students can execute every single skill. We might just ask them like, hey, was this helpful? And how can we do it better, right? That also helps us design better trainings. So I wouldn't use just surveys in a course, but I do think it is good in combination with tests or projects or portfolios and that sort of thing. And then finally, surveys, they often use Likert scales, right? That 1 through 5 scale, agree, somewhat agree, and so on. Or free response is also common when you want to ask students about specific areas or have them submit maybe possible areas of improvement that we can look for. Okay, so surveys, I think another strong option for summative assessment. Additionally, some things to think about when you're creating your tests or your assessments are the concepts of validity and reliability. These come up a lot in the education world, so I just want to talk about them briefly. They'll mean something different kind of depending on what test you're building and what your content area is. But when we talk testing validity, in general, we're talking about how well a test measures what it is intended to measure. Okay, I like to think of validity as the equivalent of accuracy in science. Okay, if we're trying to hit this target, right, an accurate shot would hit the target in the middle, or on average, hit the middle, right? Validity, we're trying to hit our target of what we're intending to measure. Okay, so when we talk about validity, there's a couple ways we can apply that. How are we measuring what we intend to? What we can look at is all the content from our training represented. Right? Do we have content validity? Do we have a test question for, right, each of our standards? Do we have test questions that cover kind of each type of those standards? Do we need more questions? Right? Those are content validity concerns, something to think about. Also, there's construct validity, where we're asking, are the right skills being measured? Right? Are we measuring that learning standard that we're intending to? Or are we actually measuring something else? Or maybe something's getting in the way of that measurement. Right? That's really common in my background as a math teacher, where we're trying to measure an algebra concept, but really fractions are getting in the way of the entire concept, and students can't get past that part. So our construct validity might not be very good because there's another skill, a prerequisite in this problem, that's kind of blocking our ability to measure what we want to measure. So something to be aware of there, the construct validity. Are we measuring the correct skill or not? Or is there another skill getting in the way? Additionally, there's reliability. Reliability represents how consistent our test measurement is. Okay, in the science world, that's called precision. So I like to think of validity as accuracy and reliability as precision. If we had a student take a test 5 times, would we expect a close result, like you see in the target in the top left or bottom left here? Or would we expect spread out results? Right? If our test results are spread out and it's the same student testing every time, that test doesn't have great reliability. Okay? So some things that affect that testing reliability. How clear our test items are will throw off the reliability, right? Do students understand the question, what it's asking? Administration conditions. Okay, if a fire alarm goes off in the middle of your test and students are intently focused and they have to go outside and come back in, that will affect, right, their scores possibly. So things that happen during the administration of a test, how loud the room is, how the lighting is, right? All of that can play into that testing reliability. Also, grading bias. If you have multiple graders, okay, we can get an unreliable test if they are grading differently. And finally, low sample size. Okay, if we're just taking one test at a time, that can also throw off our reliability there. Additionally, test anxiety or disinterest can come into play. We're going to talk more about that in a second. Okay, test anxiety is a very real thing, and it's something we as test writers and course designers want to be aware of. Right? We want to kind of minimize that anxiety as much as possible. You can see from the graphic here all the different side effects of test anxiety, right? Not fun, not ideal. We want our learners to be in the best position to show the skills they've learned. We don't want them feeling nauseous or frustrated during the test. Okay, so what are some different tricks to counter test anxiety? One is to teach the test format ahead of time. Right? We don't want students getting frustrated by the test format itself and not understanding how to work the test. Right? We want them to be focused on showing off their ability to answer the test questions or perform the test's objectives, right? So if your test has a very unique format, you might want to teach that ahead of time. Okay, we also want to provide clear instructions for test preparation. We want students to know what to expect. Ideally, they would know how to prepare, how to study as well. Okay, and depending on your content area, that might look different, but a lot of times that might be a study guide, that might be a practice test, things like that. We want to avoid high stakes testing when possible. Okay, I know this is not always possible, but I remember some of my undergrad classes had 2 tests and a final, right? That is very high stakes when we're talking the entire semester had essentially 3 grades, right? And if you messed up on one of those grades, that's a significant portion of your final grade. So kind of the more data points we can have, the less high stakes those tests will feel. Okay, so if we can spread things out, if we can test more often so that one test doesn't account for such a large percentage of the grade, I think that's really good when you can control that part. And finally, consider utilizing test retakes or corrections. Okay, this might be a hot take depending on the content area. So that's why the consider is there. Okay, you don't have to do this, but it is a way to help relieve some of that test anxiety if students know they have the option to retake or to fix their mistakes down the line. Okay, now depending on the content area, this may or may not be appropriate, but it is something I think you should consider. Okay, that's what I have for you guys today. There'll be some articles on the learning page as well if you want to read up more on testing validity or reliability or dealing with that test anxiety. As far as Knowledge Check 10, I would like you guys to complete the UNR course evaluation for this course. Okay, so go to that link. There'll be a sign-in. You can complete the course evaluation. And then for our kind of discussion this week, I thought we should talk about that evaluation. Okay. Once again, this will be kind of a one-way discussion post. You don't have to reply to your peers this week. But I would like you to provide feedback on that course evaluation by answering these questions. Does the UNR course evaluation provide a good snapshot for evaluating this course? Right? Do you think we're asking the right questions to know if this course is successful or not? That's number one. Do you find the course eval questions clear? Right? We always want that clarity when we're talking about summative assessment. And three, is there anything you would change about the course eval to increase either reliability or validity? Okay, so those are our first three questions for Knowledge Check 10. I'd like you guys to check out the course eval and just kind of think about it from a designer point of view, right? Is this going to help us evaluate our course? Is it clear enough? And is there anything we should add possibly to check on that reliability or validity? Okay. Additionally, I would like you guys to answer those same questions based on the final. Okay, so think about, does our final project for this course provide a good snapshot for evaluation? Are the instructions for the final clear? And is there anything you would change about that final project? Once again, thinking of reliability and validity. Okay, so that is our Knowledge Check 10. That'll be due next Monday, 12/8. So make sure you knock that out. Additionally, Project 4 is something you should be working on, right? Our final project. Remember, we're making that video presentation detailing how we applied the ADDIE model this semester, and that'll be due 12/12. As always, there'll be office hours this week on Thursday. If you need help, feel free to stop by. Feel free to shoot me an email if anything on the project's giving you issues, or if you have any questions on any of the summative assessment stuff. But if not, then have a wonderful break going into December here. I won't be making a video next week. Just kind of sending out an announcement, making sure everyone's on track. But it's been a fun semester. I've enjoyed looking at your guys' projects and work, and I think you guys have done a really good job. So thanks for your hard work. Appreciate it, and have a good one.